So getting into natural law, natural law theorists, basically, they take the goods model and they kind of develop it a little bit further. It's like just an alternative form of non-consequentialism. A lot of natural law theorists are theists. They're Christian, or they're religious in some way. And they believe that the world has goodness, or evil and goodness, built into it as rules that were created by God, as natural laws. And that means, for the natural law theorists, it is self-evident and it is objective that honesty is going to be good. That justice is like an actual good thing that you need to strive for. And they believe this is part of the natural world. And a law that it was, perhaps not directly created by God, because some natural law theorists would say that goodness, supersedes or is a part of God, so therefore not created by him. But, that goodness is a natural part of the world and a fundamental part of the world. So that gets me to, kind of the crux of the situation, which is disagreement between goods and disagreement between duties. I think that we have a conscience. I think that our conscience is really strong. I think that in a lot of situations, people are going to be selfless. But also in a lot of situations, people won't be selfless. People will cheat at least a little, and like any situation where you can. But what that ends up meaning, and what we see throughout history, is that there's disagreement, there's inconsistency, both between people and internally, because people don't apply their own law and their own rules for themselves consistently. There's just so much disagreement, so much, breaking the rules when it comes to this, that this like list of goods suddenly stops seeming so shiny and so fundamental as, the non-consequentialists, using whatever methodology, prescriptivist, intuitionist, whatever methodology they use. It doesn't seem as shiny anymore and nice. So my question for you and for the viewer is, do you actually think there's like a list of goods that are written on the human heart, that are part of the natural world, or maybe not fundamentally, but do you actually think that, there is such a list? And if so, how do you cope with the fact that, a list like that can internally clash with itself, and a list like that, hasn't really been maintained by anyone other than maybe the Ten Commandments? But even I can't name them, so yeah. Tell me, how do you feel about this list?
Okay, so if this is where I think the moral absolutism that you employ is going to clash with my views, because I love natural law theory, and I wouldn't prescribe myself as a theist. I would say that I recognize a face of God, a genderless and nameless God, and whatever religion you employ to identify your God, I'm willing to respect that and learn from you. But because I believe that, and I see that the golden rule is viewed in almost every major religion across the world, and I see that the basic tenets of the Creator in, say, Christianity also reflect some of the basic tenets of the Buddha in Buddhism, or of Allah in the Quran and in Islam. So I think if you can see that type of connection across some of the world's major religions, there must be some fundamental property across human beings that agrees on a list of duties that are fundamentally good. Would I say they're naturally engraved on our heart? No. I would say we have to learn them. I would say they would have to be brought up and taught to us. And you made a comment earlier that morality, or maybe this wasn't the comment you made, but what I got from it is that morality can and should be a learned phenomenon. So let's say you grow up in a society where it's a dog-eat-dog world, and killing somebody to take their territory is a part of this society. Well, then maybe killing would not be fundamentally bad to you, right?
Yeah,
so
of course.
I think there are options, but I am in full support of a natural law method. I just think that's because I believe my list of natural goods at a base level is going to be very similar to, let's say, Bob's, but Bob could have 2 extra things than I do, and that doesn't make us fundamentally a good person and a bad person, or a good person and a bad person.
Okay. Good point. So what if Bob is from the 15th century, from the Aztec Empire?
Mm-hmm.
Bob thinks one of the basic goods is respect and revere the Aztec gods. And one way, I think this is like pretty historically like certain, don't quote me on that though, is the Aztecs really liked child sacrifice and sacrifice in general.
Mm-hmm.
So if Bob has this as one of his basic goods, he will want like pretty frequent and constant child sacrifices to keep thunder away, to keep, you know, natural disasters away, etc., and to keep the gods happy. So what would you say to Bob then? For Bob, it's really important to him that, you know, the Aztec gods are kept happy, of course, and child sacrifice is an important aspect of that. What would you say to Bob?
Well, I would have to learn it first, but I would explain to Bob how the science behind thunder and lightning work, and how that while I respect his beliefs, sacrificing a child is not going to prevent a natural phenomenon, but that's just because I'm a biology student. The crux of your argument is very strong, and I genuinely don't know how I could reason with him that sacrifice is not the best option, but I have that hope in humanity that regardless of him being from 15th century Aztec society, if the language barrier was gone, I believe that we could communicate between one another for him to at least understand why I don't believe that sacrifice is an option. And I mean, if you're thinking about it logistically, the people who supported these type of things died out years and years ago, right?
Right.
So that is enough to lead me to believe that the way of thinking that they were circumscribing to was just that, ancient and needed to be left in the past. But then again, that might be a pretty harsh stance to take.
Well, the point is, I do agree with you that child sacrifice does need to be left in the past. But the point is, you know, from Bob's perspective, everything seems a-okay. Right? If he's helping out with the child sacrifices that are going on at the Aztec temple. Sorry, I don't know much about Aztec society. My apologies. But if Bob, as long as Bob is contributing to that, I think Bob's being a good person, or Bob thinks he's being a good person, right? So what kind of ways or what kind of methods can Bob approach to go beyond his society? Obviously, you can introduce, you know, modern knowledge to him, and, you know, maybe Bob, you know, really values knowledge and truth and stuff like that, and he would care a lot about, you know, the scientific explanation for lightning. But, you know, let's say he's still in the 15th century and he has no such thing. You know, what actually will move him further beyond his society? Because of course we all accept that child sacrifice is bad, right? What would actually get Bob beyond that? And that's where I think consequentialism is actually kind of really useful and really nice. Yeah. So let me get into that. Let me explain consequentialism really quickly. Basically, motivations under consequentialism, it's not that they don't matter, it's that they're not the fundamental determinant of what is good or bad. For consequentialists, it's simply, you know, what happens afterwards that matters. And, you know, the biggest form of consequentialism, and really the only one we're going to talk about, is utilitarianism. And you may have heard of it as, you know, maximize pleasure, minimize pain, or what, you know, what is good is whatever, you know, causes the most pleasure and gets rid of the least suffering. And this is really, you know, a fairly, you know, common definition. Utilitarianism can value different things and therefore is more complicated than that. But that is, you know, a fairly good way to approach it. So the utilitarian wants to act in such a way that, you know, there's more happy people, more happy beings out there, and that there's less suffering out there. That means the utilitarian, their moral duty, even though utilitarianism doesn't actually have like some, you know, important duties, their moral duty is to imagine and to learn about the world in such a way that they can ensure that, you know, universe A, where, you know, people are happier, happens instead of universe B, where people are less happy. Now, one thing you might say as a utilitarian, or to a utilitarian, is you won't know about the future. You can't ever know about the future. If you go biking, and you get into a car crash and it was an honest mistake, obviously a car crash is a really bad thing. But are you a bad person because it was just a mistake, but with really bad outcomes? And the answer for utilitarianism is twofold. One, while I did say before it isn't about intentions, it's about consequences. It actually is solely about intentions in the way that you can know the future, right? If you're a utilitarian, you have to imagine, low probability and high probability futures. And what is good for you as a utilitarian is that you act as well as as well as you can, right? So if you're going on a bike ride, an innocent bike ride, and you don't anticipate harming anyone, the maximum extent of your knowledge says you probably aren't going to harm anyone, etc., that even though the outcome was really, really bad, again, you caused a car crash, people might have suffered, the chances of that happening when you went on your bike ride were really, really low. And obviously you got a lot of enjoyment out of the bike ride. So overall, you did a good action, even though it had bad outcomes. So even though utilitarianism is all about the outcomes, your intentions and your knowledge is the thing that actually matters, because you can't know the future perfectly. If you did know the future, if you knew that you were going to get into a car crash, it's pretty self-evident, don't go on a bike ride that day, right? Because you're going to cause suffering. But since you don't know the future, consequentialism actually becomes a lot about the present and what present actions you can take now to ensure a better future. So consequentialists, they need to learn, they need to imagine, and they need to do all this stuff to be better. But I think this is a fairly, reasonable and sound approach. If you want the world to be better, you have to actually know how to make it better. To me, this seems kind of self-evident and a really strong argument for consequentialist thinking and consequentialist belief. So the twofold approach, or like the second thing of what I wanted to say, is you can't really measure pleasure and suffering. And, if it's like, if you're faced with a terrorist, and the terrorist is like, yes, I'm going to bomb this city of 20 million people with a dirty bomb, a nuclear bomb, if you like don't give me something, and you're like, well, I'm gonna, my friend, my dear terrorist friend, I can't let you bomb this 20 million person city and kill all 20 million people. I'm gonna have to torture you to get the nuclear codes out of you or whatever. I think most people would probably lean towards torturing the person. Maybe not most people, but at least a reasonable 50%, 30%. Because, 20 million people dying, that's a lot of suffering. And one person, being tortured for it is like obviously a bad thing. But a lot of people would say something like, it's a worthwhile price to pay, or something along the lines of that. And utilitarians, they accept this wholeheartedly. They say it's a good thing, that the one person is being tortured for a chance to save 20 million people, just because the numbers like really, really pan out and even out. Consequentialism then and utilitarianism seems to be against our initial moral thinking, right? Our common sense judgment, because our common sense judgment is that torture is wrong. Right. If you're in that room with a terrorist, then you are actually actively torturing them. Unless you're like a hardened criminal, you would be pretty squeamish. You would think, maybe I'm doing something wrong here because I'm torturing this guy. And you'd be right there. You're not like, it's not a really good situation. But I think that consequentialism is good precisely because it actually challenges these notions of these common sense judgments, these notions of what we think is good. I'm not saying I think torture is good, but I'm saying that the fact that consequentialism does end up disagreeing with our moral judgments is actually an argument in favor of it. Not all the time, but at least sometimes, because it shows that we finally have a theory that offers a pathway out of ingrained social thinking and ingrained cultural thinking and cultural concepts. Some societies, some cultures don't really, or maybe not now, but in the past at least, probably don't have as much of a prohibition against torture. They probably don't care as much, and they'd be really, really down to torture the person. In other societies, maybe Christian ones would say absolutely do not torture in any circumstance. But consequentialism allows us a kind of rational path out of this, where we're weighing, or trying to weigh at least, 20 million people against one person. And then the calculus becomes different. Of course, 20 million to 1 is one thing, but what if it was 1 to 1? Consequentialism won't give you an exact answer, but it does give you a rational path of, the trap of, is torture good or is torture evil? Is it a fundamental wrong or is it a fundamental good? I'm not trying to make fun of non-consequentialists here, but I think that, when you adopt the consequentialist mindset, you're kind of looking towards results and you're looking towards impacts, and that seems to me to be more productive. Yeah, so tell me what you're thinking right now.
I can agree with what you just said, because I think the logistics of that example, I'm pretty sure the example we heard in class was that the person who was being tortured was a child.
Right. It was the terrorist child, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. At the start, we were all like, who cares? Torture the guy. It's 20 million people. But then Peter changed it to an innocent child to make it more difficult. And I think, while I could not live with myself having to torture an innocent child, getting the nuclear codes to save 20 million people, I think the logic and the numbers just kind of scream in favor of having to do that, and that being the most inherent good action. Now, the only reason that I could say I couldn't do that is because I'm very circumscribed in my notions of nonviolence after the learning that I did last year. And I think that this is a very difficult situation to be in, and you're putting up a very logical case for consequentialism, because at the end of the day, our intentions do matter. And I think we can agree on this. Our intentions do matter, as do our consequences. But I think you need to be acting consistently, regardless of if you choose to follow frameworks under non-consequentialism or consequentialism, for them to be rationally sound.
I think consequentialism, again, as you can see, I'm obviously biased in this way of thinking and this utilitarian thought, but I do think the utilitarian approach is a better way of being consistent. Let me explain myself. So with the terrorist situation, where you have to torture the terrorist child to get the nuclear codes out of the terrorists, you're torturing an innocent child, which is pretty bad. But again, there's 20 million people's lives on the line, and these 20 million people kind of matter, if you know what I'm saying. You have to think, how can I actually be consistent here? Because if you're the terrorist, well, you're evil. But if you're the terrorist child, you're innocent, and you probably don't want to be tortured. But again, there's this overshadowing, other aspect of the equation, which is that there's 20 million people and their lives on the line. So let's take one person out of that 20 million people. That one person has a life. That one person has dreams, has desires and hopes for the future. They would be devastated if these desires, hopes for the future were dashed. They would be really upset if they were dying of radiation poisoning and they were actively dying a painful death, and so on and so forth. And that's just one person. And you can imagine being in that one person's shoes and being like, yeah, I really don't want to die in a nuclear explosion. Then multiply that by 20 million. People don't really do well with senses of scale, but imagine thousands of thousands of stadiums full of people thinking all the same way, and all of a sudden that one innocent child, unfortunately, that's being tortured, it doesn't seem as wrong.
Right.
And getting back to consistency here, if you were that one person in that one stadium in that one city, you probably don't want to die. But maybe that one person obviously doesn't make up for the evil of torturing an innocent child. But what if there's two of them? Two people don't want to die twice as much, right? And then 3 people don't want to die. And if you're consistent, you don't want to die, but multiply that 20 million times over, you're being consistent 20 million times. And it seems to me that this numbers-based approach towards consistency really seems to make the most sense. Obviously, with the 20 million to 1 case, it's really obvious. But in something like the trolley problem or the modified trolley problem, which I'm going to bring up, you may have seen it in memes. Basically, you have a large man. This is not the original one. This is a modified one.
Yes.
You have a large man, and there's a train track and a trolley. And the trolley is hurtling towards 5 people that are tied up on the train. But there's a large man next to the train tracks, and you're just sitting behind him, and you're like, well, this guy's pretty large. I could push him into the train, derail the tram, or derail the train. There's no one in the train, so it's fine. And I save 5 lives at the cost of, having pushed and killed the large man.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, I believe I saw a statistic, don't quote me on this, saw a statistic that was only 20 or 30% of people would push the large man.
Mm-hmm.
And, pushing the large man actively into a train is murder, probably.
Yeah.
It's killing, at least, if not murder. And it's pretty fundamentally wrong. And if you were the large man, again, you have dreams, wishes, hopes for the future, and you don't want to die a painful death at the hands of a train. But also, there's 5 people on the tracks, and they also all have their hopes, wishes, dreams, and they don't want to die a painful death at the hands of their train. And if you think about it in a consistency method or a golden rule method, if you were the person on the train tracks tied up, you would want to be saved. Obviously, with one person, that might not justify it. You want to be saved, but this person doesn't want to die. Obviously, well, it's a wash then, right? But if there's 2, 3, 4, 5 of you, and you have to apply the consistency, the golden rule to each one of them, right? Golden rule, golden rule, golden rule, golden rule, golden. Then it kind of seems fairly straightforward and fairly obvious to prioritize the 5, even at the cost of your own, mental health or whatever, because you're pushing and killing a large man. And to me, I think this is a better way of approaching consistency. Let's say we do the alternative and we don't push the large man into the train, and 5 people die as a result. We've just let 5 people die. Some people will say this. We've let 5 people die. We haven't killed 5 people. I think that distinction is fairly meaningless, but a lot of philosophers, a lot of people don't, obviously. So let's say we've let 5 people die. These 5 people, they all had wants, hopes, dreams, whatever, but obviously killing is wrong. And pushing the large man into the train is wrong. So we've avoided that. But, is the world that has resulted really better? Is universe B really better than universe A? In universe B, I've maintained a little bit more of my sanity, my mental health, because I haven't killed the guy. The large man is alive. But also in universe B, there's 5 more deaths and 5 more people that could have been alive otherwise than in universe A. And can I really, being honest with myself, can you really say that universe B is better than universe A, even though you technically avoided murdering someone? I think the answer is, as a consequentialist, I think the answer is no. And I think that's a fairly strong intuition of mine. I think that this consequentialist approach is also more connected. This is kind of rehashing consistency, but it's also more connected with facts on the ground. If you stop thinking about morality for a second, sometimes it's easier to think about stuff if you stop thinking about it. If you stop thinking about what is moral, what isn't, and you just look at the facts on the ground, the situation on the ground,
then the fat guy's dead.
The fact is, in one situation, in universe A, there's 1 dead man. Stop thinking about the morality of it. In universe A, there's 1 dead man who had hopes, desires, and dreams that were crushed. But in universe B, there's 5 dead people who had their hopes, desires, and dreams crushed. And if we don't think about this from a moral perspective, universe B is probably poor. Universe B has less intellect in it. Universe B has less, overall cognitive processing in the universe taking place in it, whatever you want to call it, right? So even if you get away from the moral approach, consequentialism is kind of tied to facts on the ground, in that universe B has a difference to it, has something quantifiable about it that isn't tied to notions and conceptions of morality. Universe B is different in a pretty fundamental way. But the difference between, let's say, a murderer and a non-murderer doesn't seem as fundamental. Like, if you've probably shaken hands with a murderer on the street, like, probabilistically speaking, like, there's a good chance that it has happened. But, like, their hand doesn't feel any different, right? And, if you're a dishonest person, or someone who doesn't care about justice, if you shake their hand, their hand doesn't feel any different either. So consequentialism is really cool and really nice to use a sophisticated language, because it's really associated with these facts on the ground, these actual tangible differences. And I think that's the biggest strength of it. Utilitarianism won't give you an answer if it's a one-for-one. Utilitarianism won't give you an answer actually in the majority of situations. But I think that it'll give you a better answer, and it'll deal better with a variety of situations than anything else that we have now. So with non-consequentialism, you might have, a conflict between notions of aesthetic, a basic good, justice, a basic good, and honesty, and, helping others, a basic good. Like, for example, the famous example of lying to a murderer to save your friend's life. Murderer wants your friend dead. You have to lie to him to save your friend's life. Lie to him that he's not in your house. Obviously lying to the murderer is good, but you have to make that judgment about honesty being less of a fundamental good than saving your friend in that situation. Mm-hmm. But upon which principles are you going to base that judgment on? Because, with basic goods, how do you actually rank them, right? You have to have something fundamental outside of that to rank them by. And that's, I think, where something that, can't be distilled further comes in, which is a utilitarian approach. Because obviously, lying doesn't really hurt anyone. Lying actually causes your friend a lot of happiness because they won't die to a murderer. So based off of that explanation, tell me your thoughts about consequentialism. I know you're not a consequentialist or a utilitarian, but how are you feeling about it right now, this very second?
Well, during the year, I argued for rule utilitarianism a lot, because what you're saying to me is very logical, Daniel, and I can agree with it. With the trolley problem in particular, I think my biggest issue is that if you choose not to push the large man, you are saving your own mental health, which is a selfish action, at the expense of 5 lives. Now, on the opposite, when you push the large man, yes, you're committing intentional murder, but yes, you are saving 5 fundamental lives at the expense of yourself. So I would say the way you're acting in this situation by killing that man is much more selfless. And I think that fundamentally does make sense, and what you're saying I can agree with. But I think my biggest issue is that I don't feel like utilitarianism gives me enough, because of what you just said at the end, to cover every aspect of my life. Doing as much good as I can for the least amount of bad, expensing the least amount of bad, is not a framework that I can apply to every single situation. So while I can say that I understand you can build from utilitarianism and consequentialism, I think you need other theories supporting it, at least for me to be able to accept it, because I just feel like it's pretty harsh, it's pretty emotionless, and it's kind of calculating. You know what I'm saying?
Well, you did mention rule utilitarianism. Mm-hmm. Do you want to discuss that briefly or no?
Yeah, sure. Okay. The only thing that I would say is that the reason I enjoy this stipulation is that the rules that are employed in rule utilitarianism are akin to the duties or the laws that I would circumscribe to in the natural law method. So I'll allow you to explain that to the people.